Good morning, everyone. We've had very rich, very productive conversations today, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this session on developments in the Pacific and to get a perspective from Australia, which is an important country and an important power in that region. I have here with me today Paul Myler, who is the Deputy Head of Mission at the Embassy of Australia in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much.
And I hope it's fine to refer to you on
a first
name basis. Okay, great. So we have about 30 minutes, actually no, about 45 minutes for this session. We're going to have a conversation for perhaps the first 30 minutes, and then we're going to open up for question and answer session. As we've heard throughout today and the rest of this conference, there are a lot of developments happening in the Pacific. There is the AUKUS initiative, there's the Quad initiative, all of which Australia is a part of in that region and much wider. But there is also the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was launched earlier this year. And as we just heard from the session before this one, the countries in the region are also asserting their own identity and their own view of how the region is managed and governed and their role in it. These are all of the contextual factors that we have to keep in mind as we undertake this discussion. So Paul, my first question to you is Australia's approach to the Pacific, to the region, seems to be evolving in recent years. What are the priorities of the newly elected government in Australia towards the region?
Thanks very much for that question. It's a pleasure to be here. I apologise, the royal funeral and a few other things got in the way of Ewan MacDonald, our head of the Office of the Pacific, being here in person. He had to go back to Canberra to cover some other meetings. So I'm a poor substitute, but hopefully can help understand Australia's position. I think over the last sort of 8 years or so, we've seen a real evolution in Australia's understanding of our role in the Pacific, our membership of this family of nations, and a deepening in that sense of kinship and partnership in the Pacific. It's we saw in 2017 the Pacific step up from the last government, and you know I'm a public servant, so I shouldn't comment on past governments and future governments, current governments. I'm just implementing the government's policy. But the one thing you can say without it being partisan at all is that new governments bring a lot of energy, particularly new governments that have been in opposition for a long time. So our current government has really come, the new government of Prime Minister Albanese has really come to this issue with an enormous amount of energy and priority. And we've seen Foreign Minister Wong really putting front and centre the need to work together, shoulder to shoulder, in the face of COVID, in the face of climate change, and in the face of increasing strategic contest in the Pacific. The Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Wong have really placed a huge emphasis on listening. I think we've heard that here as well. Pacific priorities have to be our priorities. We now have a government which is very comfortable operating around climate change, and I think that's going to be quite transformational in its relationships with the countries of the Pacific. The Foreign Minister made her first bilateral visit to Fiji, and then she's been to 6 of the Pacific nations in 11, 12 weeks of being elected. It really, she came in wanting to visit every single Pacific Island Forum member within 3 months of starting government. I don't think anybody can imagine that that is even logistically feasible, so we had to talk her out of that, but the level of commitment to being on the ground and listening and partnering was really, really important. We had the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister and Minister for International Development and the Pacific all attend the Pacific Island Leaders Forum week, and the Foreign Minister in her inaugural speech recognised climate change as an existential threat and reaffirmed the Boe Declaration. So it's all very good. What are we actually doing about it? Well, you know, the government actually legislated their new 2030 target to reduce greenhouse gases. So, you know, when we talk to Secretary Kerry and the climate change team here, the concept of actually being able to legislate your targets is just beyond, you know, the imagination of what can be achieved. We did it in Australia. They've committed to establishing a new Pacific Climate Infrastructure Financing Partnership, and really looking strongly at the devastating impact of COVID-19 and what else we can do. I can go on and on. Mm-hmm. They're looking at Pacific, the visa arrangements, Pacific workers, a whole range of other things. But
yeah. So
I've got a list so long here. I think there's anybody want to see me afterwards and get chapter and verse, I can run through it, but there's a lot going on.
Sure. So without going into that list in detail, if you could walk us through the thinking of the government that you represent on what is being prioritized with respect to infrastructure and economic development for the Pacific Islands, because we have heard from some of the representatives of those countries here that for a lot of them, climate challenges are very much intertwined with national security and maritime security issues. And at the root of that is really sustainable economic development. So if you could walk us through not the details, but the kind of thinking and the kind of approach to meeting some of these development priorities in the region in a way that responds to what those countries themselves have outlined as their own priorities.
Yep, I mean, and that's the key, right? Don't ask us what the priorities are. Ask the Pacific Islands what the priorities are. We're here to listen to that. I think, you know, as we look at sort of immediate priorities and longer term priorities, you know, getting through the COVID-19 pandemic, not just from a health perspective, but actually from a fiscal perspective, is going to be incredibly important. There's going to be a fiscal lag as, you know, as companies, enterprises, taxpayers within these companies, you know, have accumulated losses over the COVID shutdown period. That's going to impact on tax revenues. It's going to impact on budget bottom lines. That's going to have a multi-year impact. So we're expecting that over the next 5 years, Pacific Island countries will have a combined total deficit of around 19 billion Australian dollars. This is you know, something that we're going to have to find a way to provide ongoing fiscal support from Australia, from other partners, to ensure that Pacific Islands are able to undertake the budget repair that they need to do to get back onto a stable footing. This is, you know, not any fault governance or anything in these countries. It's just the reality of losing your tax base for a number of years. So that's going to be an important priority for Australia, and we're already focused on that. Infrastructure is obviously always a challenge. Our focus, and I think the focus we've seen from Pacific leaders, we saw it in discussions with Prime Minister Marape recently, is on infrastructure that protects and enhances the economic sovereignty of the Pacific Island countries. Has to be high quality, has to be sustainable, has to be transparent in the investment process. The Australian Foreign Minister has been very clear that we will not impose any unsustainable debt burdens on the Pacific Island countries, and we really want to focus on staging infrastructure in a way which contributes to sustainable lending and borrowing practices. We're happy to work through multilateral forums. We're the chair of the G20 Infrastructure Working Group. We're happy to provide technical advice. We're happy to provide alternatives in terms of infrastructure financing and suppliers. People will be familiar with our own Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific, which has already finalised over $1 billion Australian in infrastructure financing. About 780 million of which is lending, not grant, and so that's been interesting across 10 major capital works in 8 different countries. We've done more to ensure that Export Finance Australia has increased callable capital, and they've used that to support, for example, the purchase of Digicel Pacific. We're also a founding member of the Pacific Regional Infrastructure Facility. So we are working in as many different ways as possible to make sure that the infrastructure projects are prioritised in a sensible way, that any financing is sustainable and transparent, and that any technical advice that's needed can be provided, all to making sure that nothing we do in the infrastructure space delays or postpones the return to sort of fiscal stability, which has to be a real priority now, given the COVID-19 impact on budgets in the region.
What I'm hearing from you is you seem to be contrasting the approach that Australia is taking with respect to providing financial support, development assistance, concessional financing, whether for budget support or for infrastructure, with the approach taken by other countries, other powers in the region. Of course, we know there are other powers like China, very active there. There's Japan. There are a number of others. I guess then my question is, in what ways do you see scope for potential, if not collaboration, but a kind of harmonization of different approaches for the countries that are in need, and whether there is also an opportunity to perhaps work together? So is there scope for harmonization at the very least, or even collaborations? Because in the end, for the country that is at the receiving end, having a multitude of partners can be quite complex and sometimes even overwhelming.
Certainly, and I think that's been a real focus. The reality is the absorptive capacity of a lot of the Pacific economies is limited, and so when you look at how investments are made, it's important that they are coordinated, staged well, that the priorities are clearly met. And you know, you mentioned China. I mean, China is going to be an important partner of the Pacific. There's no reason why they shouldn't be. We partner with them in PNG on a whole range of projects. So this is so it's really all about how do you coordinate well. Obviously, we have a particular focus on transparency and openness in any infrastructure projects, but we are looking to try and increase that sense of partnership, and to really listen to, in particular, the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific and the work that's been done in the Pacific Islands Forum. This is important work, and we've already heard a lot about the partners of the Blue Pacific, but that's that was quite a deliberate decision to reference to the 2050 strategy, not to co-opt it in any way, but to really genuinely say, we are here as partners, and this is our attempt to try and coordinate better amongst ourselves to be able to deliver. We've been trying to do trilateral work for example, between Australia, the US and Japan in the Pacific for a number of years. We've got some good projects up, the Palau Spur and East Micronesia Cable and the like, but actually coordinating the funding mechanisms and the accountability mechanisms and the legislative oversight mechanisms of 3 different countries into one project is incredibly difficult. With all the best intention in the world, we simply can't make, necessarily the funding mechanisms all dock into each other. And so I think, we quite genuinely, the Partners of the Blue Pacific is another attempt at trying to wrap our heads about how can we do this, recognising that our home governments and our home legislatures have set up a whole range of different parameters of what they consider to be important, what they consider fundamental accountability underpinnings. How can we, understanding that, sort of by broadening the group of partners, look at individual priorities or individual priority areas and say, okay, well, we can help with this part and just get with a broader grouping of partners with new money, which is a core commitment of the Partners of the Blue Pacific, offer something more substantive going forward in terms of partnership for the Pacific Island Forum, which has maybe had a little bit of a rough patch over the last couple of years, but has surged back to really demonstrate how important and strong a regional forum it is, and Australia as a member, obviously we see that as incredibly important, but I can assure you that other partners, other of the members of the Partners of the Blue Pacific are really seeing this clarity of purpose and direction from the Pacific Island Forum as something they really want to get behind and partner with.
Mm-hmm. Now I want to move slightly to the Indian Ocean.
Sure.
Because we have an Indo-Pacific region that encompasses the Pacific and the Indian Ocean region. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how Australia sees the Indian Ocean islands and the entities and the countries there, and what the approach or the vision or the strategy is for at least that half of the Indo-Pacific.
Well, look, we see it very much in a similar way. The Indo-Pacific is our strategic environment. I was Chief of Staff to our Resources Minister back in 2011, and at that stage we were sort of thinking about where our strategic vulnerabilities were, and a lot of it was the wealth we have on the northwest of our country, which is the Indian Ocean exposed. It's not the Pacific, and was essentially at that stage undefended. There was not much infrastructure there, and not much thought given to it. There's sort of I'm a Perth boy, so we look out on the Indian Ocean all the time. But you have to look a long way until you get to another coastline. I'd say Australia hasn't focused on historically the Indian Ocean as something other than a place that you travel across. That's certainly changed. As part of our Indo-Pacific thinking, the importance of the Indian Ocean, the importance of Indian Ocean regionalism, the important role that IORA plays in trying to crystallise a sense of community in the Indian Ocean has been really important, and sort of in from 2016, 17, 18, just as the Pacific step up was happening, there was a lot of early work being done, actually by a team I led at the time, on Australia's relationship with India, but also Australia's relationship into the Indian Ocean. We've seen a resurgence of activity. We've seen some really interesting work out of the University of Western Australia on the Indian Ocean and on initiatives around climate and the importance of mangroves and a whole range of different things that have really started to shift or started to open up an understanding of the Indian Ocean for Australians.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so my final question now, before we open up to our colleagues here joining us, is ownership of initiatives, whether infrastructure initiatives or climate initiatives, or just more broadly development and economic initiatives by the countries and the island nations in the Indo-Pacific. We have heard over the past day or day and a half or so how assertive a lot of these countries are, because they have felt for a long time that their voice, their visibility was not really appreciated on initiatives on the region. They have felt for a long time that initiatives are envisioned or crafted without their input. So they want to have a greater say. I guess then my question is, how can a country like yours support that need for ownership of these development initiatives, but also beyond development, some of the security initiatives that we're seeing announced with respect to the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I mean, our commitment is to listen and to recognise that, as much certainly for Australia and New Zealand, but for other partners, you know, we are located in the Pacific. It is where we live. It is our home. This is our family, and so we want to work with the countries of the Pacific to understand their priorities and to deliver on them. We've now got an alignment in particular because of the shift in the Australian government's climate change policy, which allows that to be carried forward without hesitation. So there's, you know, I think there's a unique moment of opportunity here. I think we've seen, particularly over this year, the Pacific Island Forum is showing their strength, and so we have a great partner there, and you know, we have a broad group of partners who are understanding the importance. I think, as previous panelists were saying, you know, it's not about necessarily about the land surface in the Pacific. It's about the importance to this planet going forward of the oceans, and so you know, you do have a broad range of partners who are looking to be active in the Pacific because of the importance long term of that resource.
Wonderful. I'm going to open up now. Do we have any questions? Okay, we have a couple. We'll probably take maybe 3 for the first round, and then he'll address them, and we'll take the next round. Okay, let's start with the gentleman over there.
Thank you very much.
And then we'll come to this side.
I have 2 comments and questions.
So can you please introduce yourself or mention your name, just so we know who is asking the question?
My name is Tassisius Kabutaulaka. I work at the University of Hawaii. I have 2 comments, and they're probably unfair, given that you are
I thought that might be coming, Professor, don't worry.
Given that you are a public servant, but I'll ask them anyway. You know, you talked a lot about what Australia is doing to and with Pacific Island countries, and that's really, really important. And I think, you know, although I can't speak on behalf of Pacific Island countries, I think it's an important relationship. But let me flip it a little bit. And as someone educated in Australia, I have an affinity to the country. I think it's a lovely place, wonderful people. But one thing that's occurred to me over the years of my interaction with Australia and Australians is the lack of knowledge about the Pacific Islands region. And I'm wondering if there is an opportunity to have more literacy in Australia about the Pacific, not only in Canberra and not only amongst the diplomats, but Australia more generally. I grew up in a remote village in the Solomons. I never saw a car until I was 12 years old. But in our primary school, we used to sing Australian songs like Kookaburra is sitting on the old gum tree. I had no idea what the kookaburra was, and I had no idea what the gum tree was. But it created knowledge about Australia that we had before leaving the Solomons. I see that absent in Australia, and therefore, one of the important things about being family is to know your family members. And so I'm wondering whether this gives an opportunity for more literacy about the Pacific Islands, more broadly, within Australian schools. My second question is this, very quickly. We have a long-living culture of Indigenous Australians, and they hardly feature in the diplomatic relationship between Australia and the Pacific Islands. And perhaps this is an opportunity, apart from recognition to countries every time we meet, that there is a real need for engagement of Indigenous Australians in the relationship with Pacific Islands.
Yeah.
Right.
So
let's take 2 more.
Okay.
And then let's do this side. And then for the second round, we'll come back to this side. This lady and then the gentleman. Please make your question brief so we can take as many as possible.
Yes, I'm April Herleby from the Center for Naval Analysis and the National Bureau of Asian Research. It's a good follow-on, actually, to Dr. Kabutalaka's question, because I wanted to get into the Partners for the Blue Pacific of one, how do you ensure that Pacific priorities are front and center? And given that indigenous knowledge and unique cultural aspects, I agree that sometimes there is a lack of literacy, so it's sort of a follow-on to that question. But the other component of my question was, is there going to be any sort of sectoral focus? We know climate change and climate change resiliency is front and center, and that's important, but you also mentioned telecoms, so telecommunication networks is a really vital need in the region. So is there any intention to focus on particular areas, or is this meant to be a coordination mechanism that's going to cover everything? Thank you.
Okay. And then the gentleman there.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Abraham Joseph. I've worked with the United Nations, and also I've worked in East Timor, Australia's neighbor. And I have been on the ground in East Timor and have seen the support given by the Australian government, especially in building its human, institutional, and infrastructure capacities. And also, particularly in the area of education, health, great support has been given since its independence in 2002. And also I have also worked from the UN side with OSAID. And we have trained the ministers at the time, just after independence, in how to prepare their ministry's budgets with OSAID. It was a good experience working there. My question is, there was one issue between Australia and Timor-Leste that is relating to the maritime issue and on the Sunrise oil field. I just want to know what the current situation is on these issues. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, let's go back to the professor first. Literacy, I couldn't agree with you more, to be honest. I mean, I came through my entire schooling. I don't think I did any study on the Pacific. I did Bahasa as a language. I didn't, perhaps I wasn't very much a sort of a history-focused sort of student, so I didn't do any of the historic sort of stuff. I think there is space for it. We have a natural ally in that, in that we have burgeoning islander communities in Australia that are really, I think my children's generation culturally is much more exposed to island culture, although it's sort of suburban Australian islander culture, not necessarily on the island. So, whether it be, through sporting links or just people at school and the like, I think there is more cultural understanding now. The literacy bit about understanding the history and the contribution of these countries in the past. I mean, in one sense, PNG and the Solomons are in a specific category there, but we probably should be able to do more. I agree. And Indigenous Australians absolutely agree. And this has been a discussion that's been happening within the Foreign Ministry for some time, is about how do we do a better job of using one of our great assets, which is our Indigenous culture, more than just some artwork on a wall, but the people themselves. And certainly the new government has come into being with a very firm focus on First Nations diplomacy, not just in the Pacific, but clearly in the Pacific it's going to be important, but also going out more broadly globally. So I think you're going to, we're currently standing up First Nations sort of ambassador and a unit that's really going to focus on driving this out of Canberra. We did an audit. We've got 4 Indigenous staff at our embassy in DC, which is actually pretty high. You know, it doesn't seem like many people, but it's actually, we're pretty proud of that, and it's become a big part of our thing. So I think Indigenous Australia, absolutely crucial. April, how do we keep Pacific priorities at the fore? Just keep on listening. I mean, look, it's going to be a dialogue, and I think what I've seen from the panels today is you're going to tell us if we're not on track, right? There's going to be plenty of voices saying you're not listening. You know, this is, you know, we've had it for a number of years here. I'm going to go out on a limb, and Maddie's going to shake her head vigorously if I do this wrong. But I think, yes, we are going to have sectoral priorities. I'm not sure how public they are yet, so I'll use the word expect that this is going to be. I mean, I think climate change is number one, right? Resilience and adaptation. There's a whole grouping around disaster relief and things like that, which is all interwoven with climate, really. Secure and resilient technology and connectivity. This gets back to the Tongan Prime Minister's comment about how do you make schooling resilient in the islands. You don't build bigger, you know, stronger schools. You build stronger technology so that the school can survive whatever gets thrown at it. Protection of the ocean environment, people-centred development, resources and economic development, and political leadership and societal resilience are going to be the key. I mean, they're just the headline tags, and you know, through the week you'll start to see some actual priorities come out. But you know, that we're meeting with Pacific Island leaders here this week. You know, that's, you know, our pitch. Have we got it right? They can come back to us, tell us again whether we've got it right or not. You know, we've had a series of discussions. I think there was a phone call that happened or is happening in a couple of hours. You know, this is an ongoing process of trying to bounce backwards and forwards with them. Sunrise. Look, I mean, as you know, there's just a very firm view from the parts of the Timor-Leste leadership as to how this should be developed, and it's not a view that's shared by the companies involved. You know, we if I remember rightly, the deal was that 80% of the revenue would go to East Timor, to Timor-Leste, if it was developed in Timor, and 90% of the revenue would go to Timor-Leste if it was developed, if the production of the gas was done in Darwin. It's either way, the benefits flowing. The reality is there's just a really, really, really deep trench, and the engineering of getting the gas to Timor is really, really, really tough. I honestly don't know how that's going to be resolved.
Great. Let's try and take a couple more questions.
Absolutely.
Please keep your questions under 20 seconds, no long preambles, just so that we can get through to all of them.
Thank you for sharing the views of Australia on Pacific Islands development. So my name is Anne, and I come from a non-bipartisan NGO. Sorry, I haven't been spoken for a while. Non-bipartisan NGO IRI, and we're very much interested in
just ask the question. Ask the question.
the steady development, democracy in the Pacific Island region. So you mentioned that Australia has huge commitment to support the Pacific Island countries with climate change, infrastructure, and economic development. In the past, I believe there were certain conflicts in the region with Australia due to the advancement of democracy that you wanted to see in the region. So just curious what the current government's take on advancing democracy is, while also supporting the economic and infrastructure support in the region and addressing the urgent needs of climate change. Thanks.
Any other question? No? Okay. Just one.
Just one. That's all right.
Democracy
Just-
promotion versus
just
other.
an easy one. Well, no, but I mean, look, the Pacific is a region of democratic countries. Whatever we can do to support democracy, we're not there to do anything, but to support the democratic processes, we will. Yes, you know, there have been times where democracies maybe struggled, and you know, that's been challenging for Australia's relationship with those individual countries. But you know, as we saw with the Solomon Islands more recently, you know, we've been funding elections in the Solomon Islands for 20 years. We're going to continue funding elections in the Solomon Islands. We're huge supporters of Papua New Guinea when they go through what must be one of the most complicated, election logistics exercises that's possible. So we'll always be there to support democratic processes, and I think that Pacific, the people of the Pacific have chosen democracy, and they'll continue to choose democracy.
On that note, please a round of applause to Mr. Paul Myler. Thank you very much, everyone, for a very engaging discussion.